First reading this morning is from the book of Exodus. Moses makes new tablets. The Lord said to Moses, "Cut 2 tablets of stone like the former ones, and I will write on the tablets the words that were on the former tablets, which you broke. Be ready in the morning and come up in the morning to Mount Sinai and present yourself there to me on the top of the mountain. No one shall come up with you, and do not let anyone be seen throughout all the mountain. And do not let flocks or herds graze in front of that mountain." So Moses cut 2 tablets of stone like the former ones, and he rose early in the morning and went up on Mount Sinai as the Lord had commanded him, and took in his hand the 2 tablets of stone. The Lord descended in the cloud and stood with him there and proclaimed the name, "The Lord." The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for the 1,000th generation, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, yet by no means clearing the guilty, but visiting the iniquity of the parents upon the children and the children's children, to the 3rd and the 4th generation. And Moses quickly bowed down to the ground and worshipped. He said, "If now I have found favour in your sight, my Lord, I pray, let my Lord go with us. Although this is a stiff-necked people, pardon our iniquity and our sin, and take us for your inheritance." He said, "I hereby make a covenant. Before all your people I will perform marvels such have not been done in all the earth or in any nation, and all the Lord among whom you live shall see the work of the Lord, for it is an awesome thing that I will do with you. Observe what I command you today. See, I will drive out before you the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Take care not to make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land to which you are going, or it will become a snare among you." Here is the Old Testament reading. The Gospel is from the book of Matthew, chapter 22, and verses 34 to 46. When the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, an expert in the law, asked him a question to test him. "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" He said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbour as yourself. On these 2 commandments hang all the law and the prophets." Now, while the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them this question: "What do you think of the Messiah? Whose son is he?" They said to him, "The son of David." He said to them, "How is it then that David by the Spirit calls him Lord, saying, 'The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under my feet'? If David thus calls him Lord, how can he be his son?" No one was able to give him an answer, nor from that day did anyone dare to ask him any more questions. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Thank you, Wendy.
Some of you have to think back a long way, I guess, but when you were raising your children, did you ever have a moment of revelation that you were treating them in exactly the same way that your parents treated you? When you were talking to your children, did you ever hear your dad's or your mum's words coming out of your mouth? Perhaps you were confronted with the truth that you were acting just like your parents. I remember when I went to the States and had a lecturer who was the same age as my dad. I thought that covered my thinking about the lecturer. Once, when our daughter was about 9, I came into the kitchen and found her on a stool. She didn't look exactly like that, reaching into the pantry for something. And I instinctively assumed that she was doing something wrong, and I smacked her. Only to find that her motives were good. I can't remember. And I had a conversation with her, Joe, yesterday, and thankfully she can't remember this event, so she wasn't bruised by it. At least I'm assuming that's the case. You know, I didn't stop to ask why she was up on a stool in the kitchen. When we were children, Ruth and I and other 2 siblings, we didn't get too many smacks, but we did get them, and we also understood why. So I guess we always felt we probably deserved it, and we asked for it. Sometimes our actions and words that reflect our parents' actions and words are good. At other times we can feel that our actions and words that echo our parents' behaviours are not good, not healthy, and possibly even destructive. So in our reading for today, we hear about the God who visits the iniquity of the parents upon the children and the children's children to the 3rd and the 4th generation. And if we haven't recognised this pattern of behaviour in our own family tree, then maybe we've seen it in other families. Sometimes it's not so easy to see it in your own family. Some parents let their kids get away with, we say, blue murder. And we wonder what will happen with those children in the future. Other parents yell at their children much more than they hug them. And we wonder if the children will repeat that kind of behaviour with their kids. The writer of Exodus tells us that the sins of the parents may be repeated to the 3rd and the 4th generation. In stark contrast to that, we are told the Lord keeps steadfast love. And there are 2 different ways translators deal with this. Some say, keep steadfast love for thousands. But in this context, I think it reads better when it says for thousands of generations. Some of us grew up with a picture of the judgment of God enduring for what it felt like 1,000 generations. But the writer of Exodus talks of God's love enduring for 1,000 generations. What a picture of the grace of God persisting in the face of our accountability for our sin. As I do family tree research and go back 3 generations to my great-grandparents, and I've got quite a bit of information about great-grandfathers and great-grandmothers, I can see some positive and some negative influences passed down the generations. But it's hard to imagine God's faithful love over 1,000 generations. If a generation is 25 years, then 25 generations, 25,000 years. Think of God's love being faithful for all that time and be encouraged. We don't live long enough to know a love like that in its fullness. In effect, we only have glimpses of the love of God. But let's look at the context for our reading today. When Moses first came down Mount Sinai, has anyone been up Mount Sinai? Okay, because I had a Vietnamese colleague who did a trip to Israel and they celebrated Holy Communion on top of Mount Sinai.
Leonie went there.
Leonie did that too. Yeah, okay. Anyway, Moses came down from the mountain the first time with the tablets, and he discovered that his Hebrew people were worshipping a golden calf they had constructed. And John had that, well, the picture's still there. In his spontaneous anger, he smashed the tablets on the ground. There's some smart people who talk about Moses as the first person who used a tablet. And yeah, and there's another one about Moses taking the tablets and fled into the wilderness, and the first case of diarrhea in the Bible. But let me come back to what's serious here. Our reading for today, Exodus 34, tells us that God called Moses up the mountain again so he could rewrite the commandments for Moses. God was giving Moses and the Hebrew people a second chance at being his chosen people. How good is God to overlook our failures, to try with us again, even when we've let God down. And so Moses obeys. He cuts 2 tablets of stone and set off alone up the mountain for a second time. I found myself wondering, how heavy were those stones? And how far was it up the mountain? That's part of the reason for asking, has anybody been up there? Moses had to be ready to go with God on this second chance, to take up God's gracious offer. And verse 5 tells us, the Lord descended in the cloud and stood with him there and proclaimed the name, the Lord. What a privilege that the Lord came to meet him and introduced himself. What a revelation to Moses. And when we meet someone for the first time, we normally stand together and share something about who we are. Well, God shared something about who God is. He revealed himself to Moses quite explicitly. Now, as I share what God said to Moses, ask yourself if this is how you have understood God, or how you understand God. Because I believe strongly that the way we understand God shapes the way we live. If we believe God is harsh and demanding, then we will believe we have permission to be the same. Even if we believe there is no God, then we will feel free to be the God of our own lives, free to be and to do what we like. The way we understand God shapes the way we live. Therefore, it's important for us to have a clear understanding, a true understanding of God, as best we can. God is always mystery as well as revealed in Jesus. How can we live for God if we do not have a clear and a true understanding of God? And so let's just read this text. The Lord passed before Moses and proclaimed. He introduced himself. The Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for the 1,000th generation, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin, yet by no means clearing the guilty, but visiting the iniquity of the parents upon the children and the children's children to the 3rd and the 4th generation. Is this how we understand God? Is the God you worship, the Lord, a God of mercy and grace? Is the God I seek to honour with my life slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness? Is your God one who stays strong in love for 1,000 generations? Well, you can't live that long to test him, I guess. Does the God I pray to forgive sin while allowing the consequences of our actions for 3 or 4 generations? And when I was a child, I had a strong sense that I must respect God because God was the one who set the standards for living. Consequently, I think I held back from God. But this picture of God in Exodus is more inviting, it's more welcoming than I understood then. So I probably still need to learn to let my guard down, so to allow God to come close. When God revealed himself to Moses so fully, the only appropriate response from Moses was to worship. No other response to God was adequate. He recognized the true worth of God. And when God shows himself to us, the only appropriate responses are praise and gratitude, followed by obedience. But then Moses surprises us. He's confident that his relationship with God is secure, and so he makes a bold request. You know, sometimes our requests of God are so small that we would honour God more by making a substantial request. But listen to what Moses said to God. "O Lord, I pray, let the Lord go with us. Although this is a stiff-necked people, pardon our iniquity and sin, and take us for your inheritance." Moses was asking God to be gracious to them. I know this is a stiff-necked people. That's been my experience over decades. Not likely to change direction, too set in our ways, not really focused on you, the Lord. Nevertheless, God asked Moses to take them as his people, his chosen people. And God's immediate response is to make a covenant with them, to make a commitment to them. God was going to perform marvels amongst the Hebrew people, and they would see him at work. God said to Moses, "Observe what I command you today." God required accountability to the 10 Commandments he had written on the stone tablets. But God did not say, "Obey the 10 Commandments and then you will be my people." Rather, God said, "I will take you as my people, and I expect you to live by these 10 Commandments." Did you get the distinction? These commandments are for your good. But they are not conditions on which you must fulfill before I will love you, before I will live with you as my chosen people. But next, God said, "See, I will drive out before you the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and Jebusites." You may rightly be thinking, what sort of God is this? How does this fit with the God of steadfast love who just appeared to Moses? This God appears to care for Israel, but for none of the surrounding nations. And this is, in my mind, it's a nationalistic God who apparently cannot see beyond his own nation. Now, maybe that's a provocative statement, I know that. There are other parts of the Old Testament, thankfully, where God is not limited to a nationalistic perspective. Maybe God was not presenting himself as nationalistic, but the writer of Exodus was presenting God as nationalistic. However we wrestle with this verse, Israel's self-understanding was that they were God's chosen people. When I put a flag on the screen, it brings you to today. At times in their history, it seemed that God was their special possession. Their God was the God of their ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Their God was the God of the great prophet and leader, Moses. And in my lifetime, I've thought that this sense of destiny as the people of God sounded arrogant. I remember a little verse in Sunday school, how odd of God to choose the Jews. If their God was the one who helped them overcome all the different peoples in the promised land, the Canaanites, the Jebusites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Hittites, etc., If their God was the one who helped them overcome all those people in the promised land, I wonder if today they might make a claim that this land is theirs, gifted by God, and therefore they have a right to expel the Palestinians from Gaza and the West Bank. Israel's conviction that they are the chosen people of God, that God continues to call them, and I checked on the internet to make sure that they still believe this. This may prove a dangerous conviction if it contributes to further conflict rather than to peace with one's neighbours. Already this week, in response to what I wrote in the Wave about praying for Israel and Gaza, I've had an email communication with one particular person about what I wrote. It's impossible to answer this question simply, but it is still worth asking, what does God desire as the outcome of this conflict between Hamas and Israel? Is God solely on the side of Israel, as the stance of some politicians suggests? Some Christians, at least on Facebook, have been saying, quoting Psalm 122 verse 6, pray for the peace of Jerusalem, words written about 3,000 years ago. I'm not saying we shouldn't pray for the peace of Jerusalem, but should we not also be praying for the peace of Gaza? So now I'm glad, in fact relieved, to take you to the New Testament, to the Gospel passage for the day, because here we have the simple two great commands of Jesus to love. Love God with all of our being, and love our neighbours as we love ourselves. I believe such commands are found in all the great world religions. But Jesus here, when he quotes these verses, he's actually drawing on his own Jewish heritage. The command to love God with all your being comes from Deuteronomy 6. The command to love our neighbour as we love ourselves comes from Leviticus 19. And Jesus said in that passage that Wendy read, these two commands sum up the whole law of God, the whole of the first 5 books of the Bible from Genesis to Deuteronomy. And the command to love our neighbour is supported by further Jewish commands to love the stranger or the alien in your midst. Make them welcome. So I find such verses in the law challenging our understanding of a nationalistic God, a God for a particular nation alone. For me, the good news of the New Testament, the good news of Jesus, is that God is not just the God of Israel, but God is the God for all peoples. And this God calls us together in love. This God's steadfast love is not simply for the Jews, but for all peoples of every race and culture. This God calls us to communion with himself. Amen.